Thanks for joining us at the OLSEN Gallery. I'd like to begin by recognising the traditional owners of the land that we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. And welcome all of you to the OLSEN Gallery this afternoon for a bit of a chat about this beautiful artwork that surrounds us here, that's been painted by the fella next to me. My name's Robbie Buck and this is James McGrath. Hello James.
Hey Robbie, thanks for being here.
That's right.
Robbie was supposed to go on a holiday this afternoon, today, and he stayed for this. So.
This is like a holiday. This has been 20 years in the making. For those of you that don't know, and most of you do, but James and I are kind of related. He's my brother-in-law, and so we have been sort of digging each other for 20 years and more. But of course, I've been watching him paint over that period of time, and it's really exciting to be able to have a chat to him about what he actually does for all those hours in his studio, because I'm sure you'll agree the results are pretty extraordinary. But what you're seeing around you here this afternoon is in fact the culmination of many decades of progression, really. And we'll get to this point as the talk goes on. I should let you know that we're not going to be here forever, so if you're anxious about having to sit down and listen to me interview James, we're only going to do it for about half an hour, and if there are any questions at the end of that, we'll get a few of those in, but it's not going to be a long, boring session. Come on in, come and take a seat. There's two here, 2 seats just for you two gents, perfect. But there's obviously sort of two very different kind of streams of discipline going on within this one room, or 3 or 4 actually. And we're going to sort of tie all of that together. But a lot of this starts many years ago, and it starts with another great Australian artist, and that is Arthur Boyd. And it starts with a very young James McGrath in his teens. So let's start in, how many years ago? 35 years ago, yeah, in the Southern Highlands.
At Bundanon. Actually, I was his studio assistant when I was about 17, 18, just I left high school, before starting architecture. And this show is a funny way, 35 years later, I've come back to him a little bit, and his ideas. Because when I was with Arthur, everyone knows Arthur and his landscapes, but when I was with him 24/7, he actually had this other side, which was a much more critical. At night he'd do these drawings, illustrations of poetry and things like that. They were very dark, black, monochromatic pieces, and during the day he'd be doing these beautiful landscapes, which you know.
Can you guys hear him at the back? Yeah. Good.
So as Robbie said, this show's got 3 aspects to it, but the left side and the right side, you probably notice.
Well, it's actually their right and their left.
Thanks, Robbie. Yeah. And how they relate is the sort of key issue of the whole show. Why are they together in the same space? And I think that's the question. Well,
let's dive into that question, because for people who've been watching you paint for the last couple of decades, and there are many people here who have, these sorts of paintings here are a natural progression to what you've been doing in the past, but these are seemingly new. So let's start on the audience's right-hand side.
On the right-hand side.
And get to this point here, because for those of us who've watched you paint over the years, we've seen a lot of flowers, and we've seen a lot of animals, we've seen a lot of books as well, but we've seen a lot of reference to great European art and history. So sort of take us back through some of the years and the evolution to get to this point for you.
Well, I was going back to Arthur again. He would say, and everyone probably knows this quote, that you can't own a landscape. And he didn't mean that, well, ironically, he owned maybe 3,000 acres around Bundanon. And he actually, in the end, he gave it back, was the Bundanon Trust. Because in his soul, he was an anarchist. He just didn't want to know about wealth, money, but he knew he had to create it to get this up and running, and gave it back. So he was very uncomfortable, I think, with 1, owning landscapes, and 2, painting them in a funny way, because he knew when he painted them, it was a kind of visual ownership, particularly the Australian landscape, and he was very uncomfortable of he was self-aware, let's put it that way. He was not uncomfortable. He was aware of his own, the issue of him painting the Australian landscape as he was very British-based, European, Western artist. And the way he sort of reconciled that in his own head, I believe, was by dropping in to these Shoalhaven, say, landscapes, mythic or biblical scenes of Nebuchadnezzar or Leader and the Swan or whatever into these Australian landscapes to sort of make it explicit about Australian landscape, European artist, and how can a European artist give an honest account of imaging the Australian landscape without it being about ownership and objectifying the landscape. And that sounds all very theoretical, but it actually isn't, because it's a very practical thing. When you come to a landscape as an artist, as a Western artist, it's very much about breaking it down into foreground, midground, background, because that's how we've all been trained, as a perspectival kind of understanding of representation. And that issue of making a theatre set out of landscape breaks down in the Australian landscape because it doesn't work. Often there isn't a horizon line, or perhaps the space there's no space other than it's just an endless space. So coming back to this, Robbie.
Yeah, sorry. You're actually really ignoring my question here, but that's fine. Yeah.
Sorry.
There's nothing unusual with that, nothing.
I'm overthinking this, but so over here are 17th century hunting scenes where they were completely comfortable of owning the landscape. Not only that, they'd have the idyllic landscape in the background and this sort of incredibly violent foreground, and they'd never worry about the reconciliation between the two. So I've taken out the hunted animals,
the fox, yeah,
the mainly stags or boars, and replaced them with another genre of the Dutch still life. And so now the animals are attacking. They're sort of attacking themselves. They're eating themselves in front of the landscape, eating the landscape. And
well, they're not really. They're eating the flowers.
They're eating the flowers.
So, you know.
But this is for me, it's a metaphor for our own kind of climate, the issue of climate, and how we're not seeing our own self eating ourselves. Because in the way we see these paintings now, these hunting series are just terrible, barbaric pieces. And you can buy them for like $100 because no one wants them. The original 17th century version.
So we shouldn't be buying yours.
No,
what you're saying. We should
absolutely.
be.
So that's what they are.
But tell us a little bit about why, and we'll get to this side in a second. But tell us why that era and that style of painting has fascinated you for such a long period of your career, because it's an incredibly laborious and difficult way to paint in lots of ways. It takes a great deal of skill to be able to come up with that level of density on the canvas. So give us a bit of insight as to why that has been such a fascination for you.
What was interesting with this show, I've used a new technique, which you can see behind me too, is that you can just see the embossing. Can you see this sort of splatter up there? Which is where I pour a medium, float it on the surface, on a horizontal surface, so versus painting vertically. So the background's painted vertically like a normal easel, and in the foreground you can actually feel they're embossed. This sort of something like an apparition of the surface emerging from the background, sort of taking over like a virus. What was your question? What am I doing there? I mean, I think again, very strong. It's very much about foreground, playing with foreground, and background. Background's blurred, broader brush.
You're not answering my question again. And the question is, what is it about that? And you are changing the way that you, the technical aspect of what you do over the years. But why this fascination that you've had with 17th century European art and the iconography of that era and playing with that? What is it about it that has attracted you as an artist to that kind of visual flavour?
I think if you have a bouquet of flowers on your table and when is the most beautiful moment of that flowers on your table? It's when the first petal falls off and the whole thing's blooming so much that it's so heavy that it's about to collapse from its own beauty. And the next day, it's all dead. It's just all the petals have fallen. And there's a moment in art where that happens, where they've understood colour, perspective, composition, framing, narrative, and they've perfected it, but they've also made it so heavy with its own self-beauty, its own self-knowledge.
And that's what you relate to, is it?
Yeah, that it's about to collapse. It's like the collapse of beauty.
Yeah.
And I find that moment between the two a fascinating little moment in art. And you can always find it in different parts in the history of art. It might sometimes in architecture it's, say, the Baroque, sometimes the Rococo, sometimes it's whenever neoclassical. But there's always a little moment where whatever genre, they just tip it that much too far, and then it collapses like anything. And so that's why I've chosen these moments, just to capture that it's like the cusp of a wave just before it breaks.
Right. So let's move our glance to the left-hand side of the gallery now and take a look at what are obviously landscapes. And is this Kangaroo Valley?
This is Kangaroo Valley.
Okay,
yeah.
so this is the bush near a spot in Kangaroo Valley that is very familiar to James's family.
And you?
And me. I've got quite an insight to it as well. And it's incredibly difficult to paint, I would have thought. And yet here is something that to the casual eye looks completely different to what you've done on that side of the gallery. And of course we come back to those comments that you made about Arthur Boyd and the idea of, I guess, the Western gaze, or... Exactly, I agree. Take us into these paintings here and why we're seeing them, particularly with the perspex on the front and what it's about. So
what's interesting with these works is those works you clearly go from background to foreground when you paint them, and these ones actually you paint the other way around. You paint the foreground and then the background, meaning you do the sky last. Because
how do you do that?
So the sky is. So what's interesting about the Australian landscape is that, in this forest anyway, the eucalyptus forest, is that it's transparent. The leaves, they're always small, thin. There's no density to the leaves. They always let through the light. Versus say the trees over there, they're always a silhouette. You can't see through them. So by painting the sky last, you're actually sort of piercing the canopy with the white dots, and you can actually. But going back to what you were talking about before about Arthur saying that you can't own a landscape, these pieces are perspectively also the opposite to these two, because they have no foreground, midground, background. In fact, I often use an analogy that if you close your eyes and touch those paintings, it'll be like Braille. You could actually read them. So
were we invited to do that?
You are invited to do that.
That's great.
The gallery won't mind. Do the blue one over there because we can clean that up easily. And it's so they are made up of very small paint brushes because that's how I see the forest. These eucalyptus forests is very sort of piercing. It's always about piercing. It's desaturated because of that sort of sun. Versus these, which are completely saturated because of the sort of midday sun, where the colour seems to sort of bleed out of the landscape a little bit. There is actually blue there, but it's a very light blue in the sky. And the sort of chaos of the surface, the sort of vein-like structure of the trees. My point being, I guess, is that because I've never, people have sort of said, oh, why don't you're not really an Australian artist because you don't paint Australian landscapes. And I don't. And I have a reason for that, because I've always felt uncomfortable painting the Australian landscape because I've felt that European artists are not, for me, self-aware enough that they're painting the Australian landscape, like Arthur Boyd or someone like Tim Story. Even Tim Story does a landscape like Arthur. He'll place the burning rope in the way Arthur places the, like a Christ figure floating on the river or something like that. Okay,
well, so to get back to that philosophy then, that is a landscape of the Australian bush.
Yeah.
So why?
Well, I wanted to, it's all about, last year I did a whole lot of work on visualising data of scanned forests, of endangered forests, and I called them ghost trees, of these massive big 3D visualizations, very dotty, very transparent, using special laser. And I sort of realized that that was the way I was going to do landscape. And then and I still wasn't really comfortable with that because I still felt it had this sort of language of science and that. Well, I'll start back up. I thought at this time people should recognize more the environment, and they're not seeing the environment. They're not aware of how they see the environment. And I think that lack of awareness means they stop that the things like science data is not being properly appreciated. If they can't see it in a painting, how are they supposed to see it as a scientific fact?
Right.
Does that make sense? I'm not sure.
Yeah. So James, I should try and tease that out a little bit, because James did a project where he was actually mapping scientific data points for Australian forests. To represent them through numbers, basically. So instead of a sort of a visual representation, it was a numerical scientific representation to try and get to the bottom of it. That still hasn't answered the question, though, as to why. I mean, the amount of work that's gone into all of these is extraordinary, and why you wanted to do that. On the background of what you've told us about Arthur Boyd and your hesitation about doing the Australian landscape.
Well, I think I felt comfortable by putting in the same space of the juxtaposition to these pieces over here, making people aware of themselves seeing their own gaze, the gaze on the landscape, and get them to understand that the way they view a hunting scene or a female sculpture, the gaze of that as a problem is the same problem as looking at an Australian landscape. Because you're using the same Western gaze, which presumes a lot of things that aren't real. Okay.
So why the perspex?
So the perspex, well, the show's called Lascus, which is Latin for one-eyed man, and that's me, the one-eyed man. But I also feel it's also us. We gaze and we can destroy things by looking, and so. I think the sort of like Superman gazing with his eyes, cutting through the sort of visual barrier of the perspex.
Okay, so you're saying that for anybody who's bought one of these, they now have to go and buy one of those and stick it on the other side of their living room. Okay, good. Just wanted to check. Yeah. Tell us about the video at the back, and of course, if you haven't seen that. The TV screen at the back is talking to the painting behind us here, and at the moment you can't quite see that, but as it loops through, it will get to a point where the room that's behind us will emerge, and you'll get a sense of how that's connected. But yeah, take us through what the hell is going on there.
Well, I often model two things. One, I'll either start with architectural, because I was an architect, so I used a lot of architectural software to try and model in the same way that a lot of the Renaissance artists did. They'd build a black box and they'd put like wax models in it, and with one point of light or one point of view to get the chiaroscuro, the dark, light and darks. I'm just doing it with digital sets, if you like. And so to build, say, the one behind me, you have to build the shadows and the lighting and all that sort of stuff as a sort of theatre set first. And then often I will take up, this is the pieces up there now, it's based on a series I did called...
there it is, there's the room.
There's the room, but the last piece was based on paintings I did, which are called Ocular Fleur, which is about, flying through these massive Dutch still lifes.
You're right.
One thing I haven't pointed out was that the plexiglass, just going back to was why the plexiglass also in the monochrome sculptures is interesting, because traditional painting techniques of the Renaissance, High Renaissance, that would often be, say, a 12-layer technique, where with a drawing, and then they do an underpainting, which would be monochromatic, and then they would what's called glaze that black and white or grayscale painting to give it colour. So skin, they'd do a monochrome body, and then they would glaze, which is a kind of a transparent paint, oil paint, and they'd smear it across. Rembrandt did a lot. You get that sort of depth, and it catches all the painting underneath. And those plexiglasses are very much just, basically, instead of using the glaze, I've just done the monochrome painting and then just put the plexiglass as the glaze. So it relates back. It's kind of modernising that painting technique.
Okay. And the use of Venus,
Well, I sort of got, okay, I can be random sometimes and frivolous.
Really?
Yeah.
Good.
And I just became a little bit obsessed with a particular factory in Italy that produced ceramics in the 18th century of Greek sculpture, but miniaturized ones.
Yeah.
And so that series over the wall are these ceramics. But what's fun about this, because the ceramics are mass-produced things that they wanted to have a version of the Venus, the Greek sculpture, which is in the video on the right-hand side. And because they have this weird, by reducing it, you lose sort of details. It's like an iteration, and it becomes something else, the glossiness and all this. And then so then I actually found the original thing, which is the Greek sculpture, which has been scanned by the British Museum into a 3D object, which I've placed in that video, which I then placed in that forest.
Right. And the reason for that is what?
Well, I wanted the figure, I think, to be in the show. I wanted the figure to be in the landscape over there, and I felt that...
so this comes back to those comments about Arthur Boyd and sort of introducing some...
a random object, a mythic object into the landscape.
Yeah.
Making you aware, the way you're gazing at a female body, the male gaze, you're also gazing at the forest in the same manner.
Okay. All right. Just give us a bit of an idea technically about how you make a painting like that. You were talking about those, what was it, 17th century painting techniques.
Yeah.
So I know that you ruined one of them by pouring glaze on it, and I shouldn't mention that, but you did. But to tell us how, and it wasn't one of these ones here because you had to throw it out, but tell us how you do it.
Well, I think...
What's your secret, young man?
Painting is, there's two methods of painting. There's wet into wet and wet into dry. And wet into wet is when you're painting the last layers wet and you paint a new wet layer on the top so they stick together very easily. Otherwise you have to wait for the layer to dry and you put a new layer on top. That's the glazing technique. So you've got to decide which one you're going to do. And then this piece, most of these now, the backgrounds are wet into wet and the foregrounds are wet and dry, so glazing on top. So fast background, slower foreground, and painting onto the...
Don't touch it.
By putting the pour, the self-leveling acrylic pour, it's like when it dries, it's like glass. It's totally flattened, so that it becomes a different painting technique as well because it catches. Well, you probably paint it on glass. You can imagine all the brushstrokes, everything catches. It smears. It's an interesting technique versus the canvas, which is more about catching surface and playing with the texture of the canvas. Those, as I said, they're painted backwards. The opacity, they're opaque, completely opaque. Those, and they're monochromatic. There's only 4 colours, and in fact, they took so long. I had to.
Well, which takes longer?
Much longer.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Much longer.
And they take a long time.
Yeah, but the skies, I mean, I've found the skies to be really fun. I find them just fun to do. They're madness. There's a chaos in those.
What about Persian rugs? That seems like a stupid idea.
Yeah, that's a stupid idea. Yeah. So. But interesting, like the same brushstroke technique is in the trees.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that means.
And your reflections are out of focus here.
Yeah.
Is that because you were drunk, or is that just...
Well, yes, no. I thought about doing the same technique on those, but I wanted to be meaning to pour, but I felt that they were then absorbed into the architecture.
Yeah.
Whereas the other thing is that because they're mirrors, the reflections, so they're in the space on the surface versus the one which has just sort of been. It's like a portal that's just opened up and this thing's gone zip and emerged. Mm-hmm.
And the perspective looks like it would be a very difficult thing to master.
Well, yeah. Well, it's interesting. So there's lots of types of perspective. This one's layered, what's called atmospheric perspective. As it goes back, it becomes bluer, more blue. Mm-hmm. This has no perspective in it. It's completely about surface and chaos. And this one has 2-point perspective where there's two, if you can draw the lines, there'll be a vanishing point over there and a vanishing point over there. So there's sort of all different types of perspective in here. And even what I like about doing the 3D pieces is the videos, is and I've always felt this about digital CAD space, is this idea of you start in a black void where perspective is it's about 2-point perspective and how you build a space within a space, within a void space.
So are the videos non-fungible tokens, and are they $60 million?
The one on the Venus is going to have a non-fungible token. Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Woohoo! NFT, yeah.
Because I feel like people, no, I think I will get tokens for all of these.
Yeah.
Because I actually think the NFT is a really good idea, not
Do you?
because they're for money-wise, but I think
Well, you're an artist.
not for selling, but for actually attaching a sort of micro contract to a painting, which is what they are. It's like a title deed that everyone can see, and who owns it, and that they own the original one.
So has everybody heard of NFTs? No. So this is, I mean,
Blockchain
all this stuff around you is actually old-fashioned. I mean, it's actually way past its use by date. The future is NFTs, where artists just sell digital keys to their digital artwork for millions of dollars.
Matthew and Fiona just bought an NFT they don't even know it yet. So
did they? Yeah. For millions of dollars?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
But it means you can put it online and trade it, your token. Yeah.
Now, true to my word, we have just hit the half an hour mark. Which means if we've bored you to death, you can get up and leave. Yeah. But if you do have any questions for James, you can chuck them at him right now, and he will answer. Actually, he'll ignore your question and say something else. That's usually how
I'm a typical politician.
Yes.
Where is the room?
Oh, it's in Austria. It's interesting. I don't actually know I can find it, but I actually, prior to doing this sort of piece, I used to do massive Baroque ceilings, the massive institutional size, and these pieces have come back to being very domestic spaces. So they're actually in someone's house. It's actually not and so the scale's different, and it's sort of more like a figure. You can actually put a figure in it, and it's the scale of a body in there versus these massive ceilings I used to do. So it could be it's actually any domestic Baroque space sort of thing.
That's your summer palace,
isn't
it?
It's my summer palace.
So, yes.
When you... Sorry.
Yeah, yep.
When you were introducing yourself to the Australian landscape again, was there any sense that it might morph into the type of thing that you did with Pozzo on cloth, where it actually changes its perspectival relationship?
You know, Pozzo, that's what I was talking about, the ceilings and this idea where he's a perspectivalist who created these fantastic 17th century ceilings with perfect perspective. And the idea was that they were that the sort of narrative frame, they started falling out of the ceiling with the figures, the cloth, unwrapping the perspective, if you like. That was that series, and in here it's interesting you say that I've always wanted to map this forest properly in 3D and camera match a camera going through it and have the forest, the fabric falling through the forest. It's definitely been a project that I've been trying to work out how to do. I just haven't been able to do it. But last year I did do 3D forests, which were interesting. And it sort of came up then, but I haven't been able again technically to get it right. It's kind of complicated to get.
All right, any more questions for James? Anything personal you'd like to ask him too? It doesn't have to be about his art. I'm all ears, quite frankly.
Anthony.
Is it hard to let go of a work once you've painted something as detailed as this?
No, never.
Not if you paid for it.
I think. Honestly, I think the difference between a professional artist and an amateur artist is the amateur artist thinks the last thing they did was the best thing they ever did. Right. The professional artist thinks the last thing they did was the worst thing they did. You're always looking for the next one. The next one's better. Does that mean? Should I say that? I don't know if that's a mean thing to say.
It's very disappointing.
Yeah, he's a bit of an asshole. I apologise for that. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, really. All right, anything else for James before we wrap it up? Going once, going twice. Ladies and gentlemen, James McGrath.
Thank you to Robbie. Thank you to Robbie Buck.